Yes. Yes. Well, good afternoon. It's great to see. Hey, thank you. It's great to see so many of you here. We have over 100 folks registered to be here today, so I think the tsunami is getting ready to hit shortly with everyone else who's going to be here. We have over 35 participants over the web and from around basically east of the Mississippi. So we're very excited and welcome all of you participating over today's webcast. So with all of you being here, both physically and virtually, it's obvious that this is a very important topic, and there's a lot of interest on this discussion of smart grid. So welcome. Glad to see so many of you here. Today is the first of a three-part series on the smart grid. Of course, today's program topic is the state of the grid, uh, borrowing from some congressional, it was from the president recently. Um, the March program, March 30th, is going to be on the measurement and management of data, making sense of all the data that's coming our way. And then the April program will be the impact, consider the impact of plug-in hybrids on the grid. So mark your calendars for the last Wednesday of the month for March and April. Um, I'm Ben Hill. I'm with Georgia Tech's ATDC, the Technology Incubator, and certainly great to see so many of you here. Welcome. And I'd like to thank our speakers for being here. And we'll be introducing you shortly. Marcia Ward will be introducing you. Thank you so much, though, for your participation. And I'd also like to thank the sponsors who make this series possible. First, I'd like to welcome GE and thank them, GE, for your participation today and in next month's program. I'd also like to thank Sutherland, who has been a visionary sponsor of this series and helped kick the series off in November of 2009 and has helped bring this to what it is today, which is really kind of amazing kind of a national audience we're reaching out to. I'd also like to thank the Georgia Tech's ATDC. You can see some of our sponsors here. McKinsey and Company for their support, South Face Institute, a number of parties here at Georgia Tech make the series possible. The Strategic Energy Institute, the Brook Byers Institute for Sustainable Systems, and Georgia Tech's Office of Sustainability. The format for today's program is consists of presentations by our distinguished speakers, followed by a Q&A period. So just hold your questions until the Q&A period, and we'll save the last 15, 20 minutes of the program for that. For those of you here in the flesh, when you have a question, be sure to speak that question into the microphone so that it's recorded and can be broadcast. For those of you participating over the web, I would ask that you send an email to me, Ben Hill, and I will pass the question along to our speakers. So my email address is ben.hill@gatech.edu, gatech.edu. And I would appreciate no spam, too. So I'm just joking. Slides and the archived webcast of this presentation and other presentations can be found on our website, secleanenergy.org. So maybe by the end of this week, we'll have the archived webcast up. The slides are already up on the website today. So let me introduce Marcia Ward, who will be introducing our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. I'm Marcia Ward from the law firm of Sutherland, Asbell, and Brennan. We have been, as Ben mentioned, we've been involved in a sponsor of this speaker series since the inception, and it's been a great collaboration Just briefly, we have about 450 attorneys, and of those, we have about 50 that are very active in the renewable energy space, and we're also able to use the capabilities of the other 400 attorneys to bring their resources and expertise to bear on different, whether it's solar, biomass, and other types of renewable energy projects. So that's been a good fit for the firm. So without further ado, let me get to the introduction of our speakers and who you're here to hear from today. We'll have a panel of three, and our first speaker, I believe, will be Gary Iyer. Gary is replacing Mike Carlson on the program, but more than capable to fit in the batting order here. He is currently the smart grid ecosystem leader at GE Energy. And his team that he leads builds a ecosystem of products and services for organizations around GE's capabilities in the smart grid space. And in the last 2 years, Gary and his team have built and established strong business and commercial relationships with companies like IBM, Capgemini, Nokia, Alcatel, and others, just to name a few. Gary has over 20 years of operational experience with Siemens, Philips, GE, and HP. Second is Deepak Devan. Deepak is the director of Georgia Tech's Intelligent Power Infrastructure Consortium. That's a university, industry, and utility consortium that provides a focal point for the academic teaching and research programs in advanced power technologies. Deepak holds 32 patents, a mere 32 patents. He's published over 200 papers, 12 of whom have been prize winners. And he's also a fellow at the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. In addition to his distinguished educational career, he is a successful business entrepreneur as the founder of Soft Switching Technologies, and he has established that company as a market leader in the area of developing and monitoring products to help factories avoid unscheduled downtimes and other types of things that would take them offline. And our third panelist is Humayun Tai. Humayun is a principal with McKinsey & Company, one of our sponsors, and is a leader in the utility operations and clean tech practices. He also leads the Smart Grid service line. Humayun works with the utility, technology, private equity, and public policy clients on emerging energy technologies and smart grid topics, ranging from technology roadmap development, technology assessment, and integration and change management. He's authored several smart grid-related articles, and his work has been cited by others. With that, our panelists will kick it off.
Good afternoon. It's an honor and a privilege to represent the General Electric Company here. My boss, Mike Carlson, sends his sincere regards. Couldn't join us today. I want to spend the next 15, 20 minutes, if I can, just giving you the company's perspective of what we are seeing in the smart grid space, and then open it up for discussion. I guess a basic primer for those of us new, which is probably increasingly rare, which is a good sign, but we keep hoping to recruit more and more people to join the industry. In the spirit of full disclosure, I myself am a new recruit coming back to my electrical engineering roots after 20 years. But smart grid, there's as many definitions as typically there are people in the room, and Deepak can attest to that. A simplistic definition is one which basically says there is already a smart, existing, robust, highly reliable power infrastructure that exists in most places in the world, not including the developing ones. But what we're now seeing is a significant and intimate marriage between the electrical infrastructure and call it the IT infrastructure. And clearly, when we talk about the IT infrastructure, we do include in that a very strong fabric of communication. So that's really the third rail that pulls this all together for us. If you look at GE smart grid landscape, and I certainly don't want to dwell too much time on the GE products, we see ourselves as a aspiring young startup in this space. We don't feel any sense of entitlement really about it. We think that the 21st century is going to mean new things, new business models, new technologies. That being said, we have a fairly robust set of generation assets, transmission assets, distribution assets, software and analytics assets, certainly services. We bring a lot of services and projects management capability to the table, all the way, like some folks like to call it, from turbine to toaster. Okay, so it does include an intimate understanding the consumer at home. It does include an understanding of what it takes to frankly let my wife let me touch the thermostat more than once a month, which is still a challenge for me. But it includes AMI, it includes meters, it includes a vision around PHEV, it includes working with large commercial and industrial customers. So if you take a snapshot, if you will, of this emerging grid, a couple of characteristics jump out that are quite stunning. One is the grid as was designed many decades ago was fundamentally unidirectional or radial, like some people like to call it. I think the complexity in a very big way of power orchestration, business model orchestration, and of command and control, or like the protection and engineers call it, how do I control it? Comes from the bidirectionality of it. And that is understating a hugely important challenge and fundamentally a source of almost untapped opportunities that lie in front of us over the next several decades. It's a huge opportunity that moves all the way down from that generation down to the distribution, from the feeders to the consumer in the house. So I was asked to put my thoughts together on a few pages for you on what is the state of smart grid. And I'm sure some of you in the business here have listened to Mr. John McDonald and Mr. Bob Gilligan from our business. I consider John my guru in this space. And one of the things we have learned along the way in these last couple of years, at least for me, in my current role as I manage the ecosystem and I've been talking to hundreds of companies around the world, is there's a few themes that jump out at us. And I've kind of organized my thoughts around demand, supply, efficiency, and then the business models part of it. So from a demand perspective, clearly, if you've been looking at oil prices yesterday and today, one of the key things that is going to have to be taken as a given is the world energy consumption is not going to decline. It's only going to increase at an exponential rate as many citizens of the world join the grid for the very first time. From a supply perspective, the existing supply, as fast as we are ramping up, we're not ramping up fast enough. And that's going to be the theme of the supply side of it. And we're looking at new assets, new generation instruments to add to that portfolio, which fundamentally add that bidirectionality component that we spoke about. The third piece is the underlying infrastructure. And the underlying infrastructure, one of the tidbits that was very early, a soundbite given to me, was the average age of an American transformer is 42 years, and the useful life is supposed to be 40. So I'm like, wow, okay, so we do know what it means to be driving on fumes, no pun intended. So this infrastructure that we have gotten used to in the developed world, where we take for granted a very simple achievement, but a really sophisticated achievement, if you look at it from another perspective, is I hit a button, and the light comes on. Gee whiz. We take it for granted in America, in most times, except when there is a 3-inch snow wave flowing through Atlanta or a cold wave flowing through Houston. Those are big achievements of reliability, scalability, and distribution from the utility companies that we need to respect and honor. But they now have a huge challenge in terms of refreshing, upgrading, galvanizing this infrastructure. A huge opportunity for them. And that brings in significant business model challenges. And I want to touch on some of those. So, demand. Let's touch on them one at a time. I like to say, we'll win the smart grid discussion one mom at a time. Okay, and why do I make it a female issue? I don't know how much my electricity bill was last month. My wife pays it. I'm forbidden to get within 10 feet of the thermostat. Those are the rules of my house, and I know who I report to. Okay? Consumers have to fundamentally buy in. And we have done extensive segmentation of consumers. And consumers are asking for an ability to influence, an ability to control what happens with their spend, which is a very big part of their non-mortgage cash flow. Okay? And consumers have a show me attitude. Will this mean I have to make choices? What is it? What are those choices I have to make? Educate me as to what do you mean when you say Deepak kilowatt hour? What is that? Is that 300 bucks? Or is it 10 bucks? So those are very basic education aspects of consumerism that GE is playing a very big role on, but we are certainly not alone, and we continue to need a lot more of it. So when you kind of look at that consumerism wave out there, we see that when it doesn't go well, coming in a blowback against some of these AMI rollouts. When consumers say, I'm not sure I understand what we signed up for, and I don't quite feel that the benefit has been quantified for me. Show me those benefits quantified. That's a very big part of the State of the Union that I want to report to you. Because we feel nervous about mainstream, very rapid rollouts in many parts of the world, and in certainly many parts of America. But there are pockets of excellence. There are pockets of great deployment happening in multiple parts. Georgia, Southern Company is doing a fabulous job. There are others like Florida Power and Light, Texas, California, increasingly now along the East Coast. And if you start looking at the opportunities in England, Germany, and Australia, New Zealand, these are fabulous deployment successes. There are other areas of opportunity in the consumerism side. Let's switch to commercial for a second. And, demand response, for example. I get a lot of ho-hum from commercial guys saying, what do you mean, Gary? Been there, done that. The question is, what can we do more, right? What can we do more? What more control, what more information are you providing at my fingertips that I don't have? And that is really to have information on a more, again, I want to use the word real time carefully, more proactive basis. So there may be some protection control guys in this room. So more control. Do I know when I say shed 200 megawatts, I actually shed 200? How soon do I know that I successfully shed 200 is the question commercial guys are asking. And there is multiple business opportunities and companies that we work with in that area. In the industrial area, we have a lot of very large industrial companies who have been very clear on the plan that they need to be self-deterministic about it. They have their own plans. Only this weekend, for example, I'll give you a real example. I went to the Georgia Aquarium for the very first time. And part of the discussion I got into, keeping my GE hat on, was how they have a backup plan and how they have a very close partnership with Southern Company because they are a massive consumer of power. And they filter all their water every 58 minutes is what the gentleman told me. That requires a lot of power. A lot of aquatic life depends upon regular, predictable availability of that power. So independent industrial organizations have always had a plan B and a plan C. Their reliability is quite different, but still not completely isolated from the grid, right? So they have a different set of requirements. So what does that demand? Because the utility kind of looks over all of that. The consumer, the commercial, the industrial, and then some. And there is more variation that we can talk about. One of the key opportunities we have seen, and we have learned that from some of our ecosystem partners in the business, is the emergence of marketing for a utility. And I don't mean that in any disrespect. I simply mean consumer intimacy is going to become a competitive advantage for a utility. It is one of those industries where consumer intimacy is going to be more than understanding how many dollars come from that meter, understanding the psychology of the family behind it, and understanding how they respond is, and again, utilities do this. Please, I don't misunderstand me. They do this and they do this well, but to take it to a whole new level of capability is the ask right now, right? The second piece of it And I'll go back to another very simple analogy from a rate case. And this was part of what I had to learn about how independently owned utilities go seek funding. And they seek it from the taxpayer in the form of a rate increase. For me, in my simplistic mind, this is akin to the Braves saying, I'm going to build a better stadium. That better stadium will help me to host more Super Bowls and will create more jobs and drive more people to come play in Atlanta. But people need to see not only a jobs angle to that, which is very important from a utility perspective, they also need to see clear benefits articulated from a taxpayer perspective. And there are some use cases that are harder to monetize, harder to measure, harder to get through. And the utilities have a legitimate business challenge. So organizations that consult with them, and I'm looking at my buddy Humayun, organizations that consult with them on the preparation of these rate cases have the business challenge of saying, let's put ourselves in these utilities' shoes, because my God, they know how to operate on a shoestring budget, and they're really well-managed ships. How do they build a business case to go to us, taxpayers, and say, I need to upgrade my infrastructure, and here is where I need to focus my attention. The other piece of it is, can they articulate their challenges transparently? And I'll leave that topic at that. From a supply perspective, clearly, there is a huge amount of government spending happening worldwide that is driving smart grid infrastructure upgrades. The General Electric company clearly sees those investments happening, not just from creating jobs, revamping underlying infrastructure, but fundamentally countries competing for a competitive advantage. Because businesses increasingly will want to locate in areas where there is high access to affordable, available power. Again, for the utility guys, they're like, yeah, we know that. And that is one of the reasons they are fighting so hard to justify their business case. So as we do that, clearly fossil is here to stay, and we can't seem to do fossil fast enough. And yeah, there are some challenges around carbon sequestration, clean coal, what have you. We all see 60-minute documentaries on shale oil and natural gas. All of that is good, necessary, and not enough. We, the GE company, clearly see a renaissance in nuclear. Very large, Southern Company here itself has got 2 nuclear plants approved, and we are thrilled about that. We are seeing very large nuclear plants come up in multiple parts of the world, which are clearly realizing they cannot depend upon fossil fuel or oil alone. They must go nuclear. It is a business imperative. It is simply an energy portfolio must-have. Wind, I like to think wind has gone beyond cool. No pun intended. Wind has gone mainstream. Wind has a pretty reasonably sound business case, and wind is happening. There are some challenges that we can articulate. One is, from a pure wind farm perspective, agriculture, universities, many of these guys are very aggressively moving ahead. One exciting idea I saw was the British government basically saying, how about I put a bunch of them out at sea and lash that power together and bring it back? It's not going to be an eyesore for too many people on the mainland. Which brings us to small wind. Again, there's a lot of untapped opportunities for small wind. And again, here, understand the psyche of the consumer. How many of us would like our home with a backyard facing a wind turbine? I think I would love the idea of a GE turbine in my backyard. That's just me. Honestly, I think it's a thing of beauty. But other people may have other preferences. And that is very important when we talk about mainstreaming small wind. It's a very legitimate issue. People may say, well, that's just cosmetics. It's a big issue. Without that being resolved, small wind may not go mainstream. Solar. Genuinely excited about our friends in Dow Chemicals and solar shingles. I can't wait. I can't wait for that to happen. GE has invested a lot in thin film solar. There's other companies out here that we talk to on a very regular basis, like our friends at Suniva. Solar photovoltaic has been around for decades. That was my thesis paper 25 years ago. Sadly, not much has changed. But anyway, solar is big, and solar is going mainstream. And again, small solar will be a compelling value proposition. In the second Eco Challenge that my team is monitoring, they're seeing some really exciting small solar companies out there. And again, to be able to make it affordable, easy to install, that even Gary can install it, is a big part of it. The second part of it, it's got to be looking nice. Otherwise, my wife will not approve. Storage, mass storage. GE looks at storage as a chemistry problem in some ways. We look this as a massive chemistry problem. We understand chemistry in a very big way as a General Electric company, particularly through global research. We have invested in a new factory in New York, specifically around that. We made investments in companies like A123, who have now gone on to become big and successful. We think one of the big areas of growth in this industry is going to be, frankly, storage technologies. To be able to take what seems to be instantly available on demand electricity and turn that to be available on tap would be a huge paradigm shift that the industry would benefit from. It is very much the day and age now of cars, smart cars, electric cars. I've been driving a hybrid for 5 years, so for me, hybrid is very passé. I will look at the Leaf and say, 73 miles, you got to do better. But it is a brave new attempt. It is a brave, brave new attempt. And many of the customers I speak to, and I just brought my car back from the Honda service people yesterday, I can tell you battery anxiety is real for us. Very, very real for us. I priced out a new battery just in case. After the 7-year, 70,000-mile warranty, what happens to my car? Will they total it? If I have to put a $10,000 battery in it. Luckily, I priced it at something lower than that. But battery anxiety is going to be real. And as a lot of these cars come on the grid, again, that consumerism excitement notwithstanding, from a utility perspective, from a power orchestration perspective, which is what the GE company thinks about, a car is like 2 HVAC devices parked inside my garage. And worse, it's mobile now. Try to balance that power. So it's, again, a quintessential opportunity for us to look at from a power load balancing perspective. It's a really good electrical engineering challenge for us. Efficiency. Very quickly. Bad debt management tends to have a rather crisp tone to it. The way we look at it is there is those amongst us who are hurting during very difficult economic times. How do we give them a chance to do microfinancing? How do we give them a chance to say, can I buy $10 of power? I can think of some relatives I still have in India who will say, on most days, I don't really care about having power. I may have a kerosene lamp or a solar lamp, but when my daughter is studying for her exam, I sure as hell would love to have power available at night so that she can study from 9 p.m. to whatever she does. And that is power on demand, being bought, not by the CD, but by a song, being bought for hours rather than for a month. That's, again, a change in behavior and a change in business model that we need to think about. As people go off-grid, that will be really key. Smart crew is an easy one. I won't dwell too much time on that, but what do we have to do to move the needle on return on assets? What do we need to do to make sure that when there is a truck roll, it is not a triangulation of zip codes of 5 people calling from the same zip code. It's a triangulation of we have isolated the problem down and we are going within plus or minus a mile of where the fault is. Or ideally, we're going exactly to where the fault is. Okay. Distribution automation, we see that as the next big wave. Clearly, many other research companies have talked about it, but we clearly see visualization of the distribution network as a very big issue. The transmission network is pretty well visualized in most parts of the world. It's the distribution network that's got the upside to it. If we visualize it, we know where it is, we can put the processes around taking care of the distribution network. Demand response, going back to the commercial discussion we had, more adaptive, more proactive, potentially real time. Let's talk on I want to not make this religious, so I'll keep it light on this one. Historically, there are many entities in many industries that I have served, including the utility industry, that have owned their own communication infrastructure. Why? Because they believe that they are first responders. So when events like Katrina happen or an Arctic freeze comes in, the thing we expect, without which life is in peril, is power, electricity. Without that, people get in trouble. will the utilities trust a publicly available communication infrastructure? What is it going to take for them to then let go of that control and then depend upon a whole new set of players to come and manage that for them? That's the quintessential debate in the communication side. And then finally, the new business models. I have had some discussions with my friend in Chattanooga, EPB, and a couple of others in the United States. As they build their business case, does the utility then, with this extra communication infrastructure, start competing and becoming more of a services provider, providing 300 gigabytes per second? As Chattanooga was claiming, they were featured prominently. It's a beautiful idea. It literally makes them one of the most desirable places for high-performance computing. Maybe Hollywood should move there. The other way to think about it is a different business model for utilities, which goes back to performance-based management, which is, will I pay a premium for clean power as distinct and different from less clean power? I don't think there's any such thing as unclean power. I mean, power is generally pretty clean, but will I pay a premium for on-demand from some other expensive resources? Or will I continue to think of power as, oh, I just pay a flat rate? And how long will we continue that delusion in this world of increasing energy prices? I think selling back to the grid has gone from a fad to reality, for sure. And that's happening all the time. And nowhere is it more evident now than the places we expected it the least. Farms, universities, government rooftops. They're all beginning to go there and say, hey, we can go off grid, we can take care of our stuff. And this is where the cool guys will come in and say, you know what, we'll put a bunch of solar, we'll put a bunch of wind, and how about we get 20, 30% of it off the grid? That is exciting stuff. You expect universities to do that. You expect the students to push that kind of a future. So that brings us to the last point that I want to make here today, which is about independent power production. And we learned some lessons about this from a brave entrepreneur in Texas, who certainly needs no introduction to many of us. But is it more than a stable of wind turbines? What if I could lash together a bunch of rooftops, commercial and industrial rooftops, all with solar on them? Would solar rooftops on downtown Atlanta be an addressable, dispatchable load? What about making it residential? So these are just some thoughts from GE. We think smart grid is a very interesting area. I'd just like to end by saying one more time, thank you for giving us a chance to be part of this family. I'm really proud to be a member of the ATDC. Thank you.
I guess I get to go next. Let's see. Okay, I think it's my turn next, and thanks, Gary, for a great lead-in. And I want to kind of throw some controversy on the table. Start off with saying that maybe smart grid is not good enough, and maybe we need smart grid 2.0. I mean, we live in a Microsoft world, and I think, before the first ones come, run its way through, we need to probably redefine what we need to be doing. Let me start with the utility dilemma. You hear this all the time. We live in a third world country, and we have a grid that's collapsing. I want to say that's really not true. I think we live in a world where we have a damn good, reliable utility system. Nobody thinks about power. You come in, you turn on the switch, and you expect it to be on. I mean, it's not like the ad you see, the cell phone. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? I mean, if you had to do that with your electricity, trying to see if it's on or not, you might have a reliability problem. If you lived in India and the electricity wasn't there for 3 hours a day, you might have a reliability problem. Out here, we don't have a reliability problem. And what it does is it takes everybody who is accustomed to this and says, I don't want to pay anymore, and this is the level of reliability I expect. Okay? And this is what we've asked the utilities to do for the last 50 years, and they've done a darn good job at it. And so today, when we look at the utilities, we see that there's a slight dilemma they're facing because, they have been doing a good job, and we are now trying to ask them to do more. It's not just about reliable and economical power, but you want to have decreasing carbon emissions and you want to have improved sustainability. Well, that costs money, okay? And we don't want to pay more, okay? And so therein lies part of the challenge. They're now having to meet renewable portfolio standard mandates, and 27 states now have it, and yet nobody's relieving them of current reliability mandates. Okay, they're saying you now have to have 20% renewable, which is maybe there today, maybe not there tomorrow, you know, whatever. Okay, and you've got to integrate all of that. And by the way, don't lose my reliability and don't lose my cost. Very tough, tough problem as we go on. Then we say, okay, hey, let's add on electric vehicles to the mix because I like that. Well, who's going to bear the cost of that? Not me. You know, let's look at somebody else to bear the cost of that. Then we talk about smart grid, as if it's the solution to everything. And clearly we are asking. We have a lot of interest. People are out here, we say, hey, utilities, take your dumb grid and transform that to a smart grid. Well, excuse me. I mean, the utilities have really been, trying to make the grid smarter, not because of any other reason, but because it's the right thing to do. You put increased level of automation in, you put increased number of smart meters in, you can reduce your costs, you can improve your reliability, you can put in distribution automation. These are all wonderful things, okay? And yet, if you mandate that they have to make every aspect of it smarter, well, there isn't enough money in the world to cover that. I had a great discussion with one of the leaders in the space, and they said, we've done the analysis, and we could take every component there is and make it smarter, and it would be a $7 trillion tab. I said, that's great. And if you're really successful, okay, we're going to have a lower per capita demand of energy, and it's going to cost less, right? And if it does, then how the hell are you going to pay for $7 trillion worth of investment? And I think that is the fundamental problem that a lot of people aren't really addressing. And so it's up to us academics who know nothing about the business world to sit down and raise the question about how the hell are we going to pay for it. So the next question, I think, is, why is the smart grid in trouble? Okay? If you really look at it, policymakers, environmental community, everybody has supported the rollout of the smart grid. And if you look at what Obama has done, I mean, a lot of ARA dollars have been directed towards the smart grid. And why is that? Well, I think the government has this feeling that if you can make the grid smarter and much more efficient, you may be able to get increased integration of renewables, you'll get integration of electric vehicles, and all of that's going to move us towards sustainability and security. Great idea, okay? Well, hold the thought. Maybe a good idea, maybe not. Well, the utilities say, hey, I see $4 billion out here, and I do a lot of work that could be called smart grid, so let me go make sure I'm in line first to get the money. Okay, and so we're going to roll out the smart grid, and we're going to do distribution automation, and we'll call it all smart grid, okay? And we're saying we're doing smart grid stuff. At the end of the money being spent, where are we? Have we implemented the task that the government was really focused on trying to implement, or have we just done what the utilities were going to do anyway, and have just taken money that was easy money, cheap money, to do the functions that they were looking for? I suspect it's really the latter. And I think fundamentally I want to kind of ask the question. I see that smart grid really results in higher costs because we're adding more money to it. If we were in Africa and we're going to build a whole grid out, okay, and we're going to make it smarter, it wouldn't cost a lot more. But if we were going to take an established grid and now make it smarter and get the whole thing integrated and get it all operating together, it would be a lot more expensive. And there isn't enough money in the world to cover that. So the question we should be asking is, A, why do we need the smart grid? And the answer is different for every community that we address. And given that we don't have all the money in the world, especially in the US, the question should be, what are the priorities that should be addressed, and what is the ROI that's going to be able to get that? Consumers, we saw a lot of discussion on consumers, and that's all we've been really seeing. And they think the smart grid is really smart meters, okay? And the question is, what is the return that's coming? And it's not very clear to us that there's going to be a return. I mean, Giri's wife looks very much like my wife. I mean, So the question then becomes, how the hell are we going to get the savings squeezed out of the consumer world when we are complaining about every penny that we have to pay that is extra? And therein lies, I think, part of the challenge. So what is required? Let's kind of get back to the top and kind of define. If we could deliver lower energy costs to the consumer and have lower energy costs at the societal level, that would be a good tick mark to put on it. Second is, we are all concerned about energy security. I mean, the whole world is going to a basket out there. And if we could improve our energy security, this would be a very good thing. And if these two objectives are met, I don't think anybody would complain about having greater sustainability. Okay, everybody would be for reducing carbon emissions and doing all the wonderful things. But if it starts coming out of my wallet, you know, God damn it, I'm not probably going to be signing up very quickly and easily either. So what are the options that we have? If you look at the major energy sectors today, we have fossil fuels, electricity, transportation. These are market segments that are kind of operating in silos and have been for the last 100 years. And they've been optimized ruthlessly by the market functions, so that it's very difficult for me to see within each silo how are you going to get a 20 or 30% reduction in cost so that you're going to be able to make the massive investments that you need. And if at the end of the day, if this results in higher cost, then clearly we've just established that this may not be acceptable. The second thing is, hey, let's put mandates out there. Okay, and whether it's an RPS mandate, whether it's, you know, we're going to have 1 million EVs in 2 years, you know, whatever it is, or the smart grid. You know, as long as these things all operate in isolation with each other, it's going to increase cost of energy likely, and that's again not going to be acceptable. So the only way I see that we might be able to do this is to deploy technology which allows us to cross-cut across traditional industry sectors to see where some of the benefits of cost savings are likely to be realized. So one thing that we can kind of look at here, we call a reflex strategy. If you look at the way we are approaching this, you know, we have the existing grid serving dispatchable generation and conventional loads. Now, if you take this and add to it renewables and backup generation and treat it just the way you treat everything else that you have today, and you add all the new loads we're talking about, the way you have to expand this business is really put the backup generation there, expand the grid in the way that we have it, expand everything else, and you can see that the pie increases, the cost increases very dramatically. Okay? What we've been kind of looking at is a slightly different way of approaching it, where we say that allow the conventional generation fleet and the conventional loads to be served by the existing grid exactly the way they're operating today, so that your fleet of coal plant generators keep running, everything keeps running exactly the way it's doing today. And because this is a very high reliability resource and energy delivery system, the grid is operating with a tremendous amount of spare capacity, and that is not being used effectively. And so to build more grid is very expensive. So maybe what we can do is have an orthogonal use strategy where we put the variable resources and match them with a new class of loads that are flexible, okay, and allow them to share the grid exactly as it functions right now. Well, what does this all do? What it allows us to do is begin to articulate a thinking process and a strategy by which we could prioritize the investments that need to be made. Remember, we don't have all the money in the world, so how do we think about this so that we can put all these things together? The metric that I think is most important is you maintain the dollar per incremental kilowatt hour served on par with existing rates and reduce overall consumer and societal costs. You mentioned storage. I think storage is extremely important. But the problem with storage is there isn't a cost-effective technology that's available today, okay? And it's 10 cents a kilowatt hour is our cost of electricity, okay? Every cost of stored energy I'm seeing is significantly higher than that. So how do you reconcile this? So we did a simple thought experiment. All of us really pay a lot for energy storage. And where do we do that? In cars. Okay, so if you really look at it, the market has determined what the cost of energy storage is, and great volume. When we have a mobile application, we pay 50 cents a kilowatt hour. When we have a electricity, plug-in-the-wall application, we pay 10 cents a kilowatt hour. So the cost of energy storage and volume is 40 cents a kilowatt hour. Okay, the question then becomes, how do we deploy this? Is there some way to deploy this so that this can be made effective? You can see that's a very large number. Okay, 40 cents a kilowatt hour times 150 million cars, okay, can create a tremendous amount of energy storage potential that can be deployed. So we did some analysis out here where we said, okay, let's take business as usual, project it out to 2030, and say, okay, what is the total incremental consumer spending? What's the incremental utility spending? What's the total carbon emissions? And what's the net cost of incremental dollars per kilowatt hour that are served. Then we said, let's go on the trajectory that many states are going on right now, where we impose a 20% RPS mandate, 60% wind, 30% solar, and we see the cost goes up dramatically. The cost goes up dramatically, and the cost goes up dramatically, okay? So, this is going to be a problematic approach. Then we said, let's just add electric vehicles to that mix. This is, by the way, it's 100% of the light automotive fleet is converted. Just kind of get some endpoints in terms of what we can do, and we can see the cost goes up very dramatically. And these are exactly the kind of things that we're beginning to see happen. If you can now do that orthogonal strategy which we talked about, where we assume that the storage in cars is now available for the grid to use, and we assume that the spare capacity on the grid can be made available for renewables to be kind of plugged into. You can see that the cost paid by the consumers goes down. You actually build in money out here to build a ubiquitous charging infrastructure. The carbon emissions go down, and the cost of electricity per incremental kilowatt hour remains. So what it says is that you really need to go across industry segments to be able to see where some of these benefits really are. So what this also does now is kind of begins to tell us what kinds of technologies are really important, what needs to be developed to make this kind of a thing happen. This is a map that kind of shows the biggest problem with integrating renewables into the mix. The blue is the wind energy, and yellow and brown is where the solar energy is, and these squares are where the load centers are. And you can see that where things occur and where things are required are far away. You also have, this is a time plot of solar energy, wind energy in California, and the total load. So you can see that you really end up with a tremendous amount of spatial and temporal variability and mismatch between the various sources. And you need to have, not only a smart grid, but a smart and controllable grid. I mean, I always tell people, when you say just a smart grid, if you're a smart driver, you can still drive off a cliff if you don't have the controls to be able to, steer yourself. And ultimately, this is, I think, what becomes critically important. So how do you control the grid? This is an area that people don't talk a lot about, and yet it's very important. This is one example of technology. It's called flexible alternating current transmission systems, or FACTS devices. Very expensive devices. What we've been doing at Georgia Tech, to blow our own trumpet for a little bit, is really trying to take existing assets on the grid, like transformers and wires and capacitors, and actually make them dynamically controllable. So this is very different from actually putting full controllable devices. You have very small amount of control that you can put on the main device and make it dynamically controllable. And this gives you the ability to control how the grid itself is performing. Here's some examples of what we can actually do with it. One example is, you have generation at $30 a megawatt hour out here, $70 a megawatt out here, and you've got essentially congestion along the path. And so what happens is, in terms of locational margin pricing, all the customers on this side are paying a much higher price in terms of energy. Okay, and you'd think that somebody would be able to go in and fix that problem and build another line. Well, the way the market works right now is nobody is incented actually to fix that problem, because all the extra congestion costs that come out of it are redistributed to market players. So why the hell would anybody build a line and relieve congestion? So therein lies the problem. But if you can take some of these technologies we've been talking about, what it can do is it can actually redirect the way power is flowing on the grid at fairly low cost and ease the congestion problem. Well, another problem, for instance, is renewable integration. This is a map that kind of shows the locational margin pricing for wind on the eastern interconnect. It shows where the wind is and shows where the load is, and you can see that there's no way to get the energy out there without having a significant penalty. And if you can start putting smart grid technologies that allow us to use the existing grid assets much more effectively, you're able to squeeze a lot of savings out of that as well. Another thing is, if you look at the way distribution lines are controlled today, because you don't have very good control, and yet they're supposed to operate within a narrow band of voltages, okay, you end up essentially, designing the line so that the voltage is high at the sending point in the substation and goes lower towards the end point where it's being used. If you're able to control the volts and bars dynamically and maintain a flat voltage profile, you can reduce the voltage across the whole bus and save a significant amount of energy. So this is another kind of technology that can be deployed. You mentioned the fact that market might be willing to pay more for green electrons, and we definitely think so. With or without a carbon price, I think there's some value in terms of differential pricing. Today, if you have a wind turbine out here and a load point out here that wants to get the energy, there's really no way to control how that energy flows, and actually flows all over the place. And of course, that's a challenge, because if I have a transmission line and his electrons are flowing on mine, I can't use the capacity on mine. We call it loop flows, and that's a big problem, and it's one that's really intractable as of now. We've been looking at technologies that will allow you actually to verifiably send the next megawatt from point A to point B using a line that you designate. And so this is the kind of technology that I think makes a lot of sense for smart grids. We talked about moving from a distribution type of a radial type of distribution grid to a mesh type of a grid. You can improve the reliability dramatically when you do that. So a lot of technologies that are there, and none of these really come back into the consumer domain. I think it's important to have the consumer be or empowered, but I don't think anybody's going to run and twiggle their thermostats to get the electricity bill down by 5% or 10%. I think you're going to get a lot more bang for the buck if you focus on this level. So overall, I think I just wanted to kind of raise a contrarian view and say that I think there's a lot of opportunity in the smart grid, and I think it's important to be asking the question why. And it's important to understand that priorities are really important that need to be set in terms of expenditures. And I think we've created scenarios out here, or shown scenarios in which there is a definite ROI. And I think you've got to kind of navigate through the regulatory mess that we kind of live in. But I think it's all doable. Thank you very much.
Sure. Check if this is okay. So hopefully I'm not going to confuse you with another presentation, the slightly different twist on things. But I think I'll be able to pull it all together. I'm going to walk around just a little bit. So what I'll do a little bit differently is I wanted to show sort of the current perspective on smart grid and sort of how it breaks down in terms of a value chain perspective, talk about why it's failing, and then give you a 10-year forward view and talk about what things will work. And I think touches on some of the things that Deepak talked about, which were fascinating. So if I took a very static view of smart grid, I would really bucket into these 5 areas. Smart metering, you're familiar with. 3 years ago, if you asked someone what is smart grid, it would be that bucket A. It would be smart metering. B is grid applications, the kinds of things that allow energy to flow on the grid properly. Automation, volt bar, some of the things we talked about earlier. Home area networks, this is all about the customer engagement, box C. So this is getting the customer, giving pricing signals to the customer to change behavior. And the idea is by changing behavior, customers reduce demand, and therefore there's societal benefit. Right? So that's the hypothesis. D is the integration of renewables and distributed storage. I think there are many facets to this, but right now the way people think about it is one box. And it's sort of clustered in, the benefits are not understood, the value of storage is not understood. It's all clustered in that one box, and then you've got systems integration, which is, to me, one of the most fascinating pieces. Systems integration, if you look at the amount of spend that is required on the grid in this industry, it's probably 3 to 4 times of what the industry has spent in the past, just to get all of this stuff working. So this is my static view. Now, each of these boxes is its own set of players, it's its own ecosystem, it's its own providers, each at different areas, different trajectories of maturity. And we'll talk a little bit more in detail about these. So keep this in mind. Now, the conventional view of the value of smart grid, so back to kind of Deepak's point about what is the value here and what's the ROI. When you look at it theoretically, so we do a lot of work with utilities on business case submissions, et cetera. Taking three broad applications, or three broad buckets. Customer applications, this is really the engagement of the customer. And a lot of the values there are driven by the reduction in consumption. You've got the operational benefits of smart metering. So this is less meter reading, less billing, collections, et cetera. And then you've got a bunch of grid applications, right? So if you just do the back of the envelope, this is annually about 110 to $148 billion of societal benefit to customers in the US for an investment of about $200 billion one time, right? So you would say that's a pretty good return. If I were to add to that the value of storage, so I don't have a bucket for storage, I don't have the bucket for what Deepak talked about, which is taking electric vehicles to actually offset, you get much more value out of this. But here's the problem, right? If you think about what is required in the industry in terms of investment, the estimate is about 1 to 1. There's a challenge here about who's going to pay for it, for the entire system. And this is where the opportunity for smart grid is very critical. Because if you believe this business case, if you believe that it is a net positive value to do the investments, and in fact that value triples or quadruples when you add storage and those types of things, then what you would say is that 6% rate increase that we require with smart grid will actually go down to 5% or 4%. So in other words, smart grid actually offsets the requirements for increasing rates. That is the ultimate pitch to a regulator. Whether they buy it or not depends on the jurisdiction, right? And depends on the conviction of the utility and the ecosystem of vendors that is providing the technology. So on that note, let me then talk about some of the challenges, right? So I alluded to the regulatory challenge. When I look at this static picture, I could have a very negative view about the evolution of smart grid. I could take a look, for example, at smart metering and say, if you look at the smart metering vendors out there, you know, I think 3 are going to go bankrupt in the next 2 years. I think there's a lot of consolidation. I think the stimulus actually has led to some bad choices being made by utilities. I think of commoditization of a Chinese meter coming to the US. You know, $55 meter coming down to $40 to $35. I would never invest in that. Yet I serve private equity companies who are looking at this space, right? So, but there's a different perspective I'll get to. Look at home area networks. See, this whole engaging the customer, this B2C model, I don't think it works. I don't think the time of use pricing in the last 3 years that you can ever point to a single utility demonstration to show that customers actually engage on this. I think much more is required to engage a customer. We have worked with utilities where we started segmenting. We thought there were 6 segments 3 years ago. Now we're at 31 segments. And we still can't figure out how to get customers to change their behavior just based on time of use pricing. But then when you add electric vehicle chargers in their garage, when you add security, then behaviors start changing. But you could take a view that the B2C model is not working the way the industry is doing it right now. And in fact, you could even take the view that hardware is not going to exist in the home. It's all going to be web portal based, which means all the investments, all the venture capital money that is going in hardware-based devices is going to be obsolete. So, negative view there. Let me talk on systems integration. As I said, 3 times the ERP spend in the industry is what's expected to get all of these systems working. But I don't think there's actually any vendor out there that has the right solution, that knows how to integrate the real-time operations front end to the back office of a utility. And we're looking for the solutions. Lots of innovation is happening, but we're not there yet. In fact, I know of utilities that are spending money, bad money after bad money, trying to get IT to work. So let me stop the depression, the negative view. Let me step back and say, okay, well, forget all of those pieces. Let's truly ask the question of what is transformational about the smart grid. To me, there are really 3 or 4 things. One is that you have generation on the low voltage network, right? So we actually are going to have electric vehicles. We're going to have CHP sold back into the grid, cogeneration, solar, et cetera, on the low voltage network. We've never had that before. The second thing is customers are now part of the supply curve. Whatever it takes to engage the the customer becomes a resource on that supply curve. That is completely different than we've ever thought about. And then storage. Storage gives you opportunity to essentially change the pricing of electricity. We've never been able to do that in the industry. So that's transformational. And from all of that, the sell to the regulator is that the customer experience changes when you have those three transformational pieces, right? And to me, that is what's transformative. It's not the meters, it's not Voltvar, it's not automation. Those are all incremental changes, but it's those three things that are truly transformational. So here's a different way to look at it, right? I think of it as different set of opportunities rather than the 5 that I showed before. There's a whole bunch of things going to happen in the home, penetration of plasma TVs, et cetera, et cetera. Certainly customer applications, and we can get into debate about software versus hardware, what takes the engagement, but there are new models happening. Demand response aggregation is happening at a completely different level. If you look at the amount of payments in the PJM capacity market in the Northeast, paid for demand response, it was 12 million 4 years ago to providers, third-party providers aggregating load for demand response. It was 512 million last year. It is rapidly growing. Distributed generation, completely new business models. We're working very extensively in Europe with utilities who are trying to figure out business models to get into distributed generation. How do they sell back to the grid? The kind of examples that Deepak showed in terms of value. Electric vehicles, energy efficiency, and obviously smart metering we talked about. Storage, data analytics. I have a utility client that is linking smart metering, outage management data to predict customer satisfaction, and they want to publish that software and sell it. Just completely different level of innovation. How long it'll take, we'll find out, but it is completely different way of looking at things. Now, with these challenges, there are clear implications. So I wanted to touch on 6 or 7 of these. The first thing is the load shape is going to change. I think there's demand destruction that is going to happen behind the meter. As you have generation on the low voltage network, you have third parties actually intermediating between the customer and the utilities. The utilities will see their load shapes change, and there will be demand destruction. In fact, I think if letter B, when you have low voltage generation, the entire dispatch curve starts shifting. I think the line between transmission and distribution starts blurring. We've already been party to some of these very interesting discussions between distribution utilities and ISOs on data rights. How much data can they pull on an hourly basis from the distribution system? Because the ISOs are not convinced that they have all the information they need with all this variability now happening on the grid. Very interesting debate. The third thing, capabilities. Very interesting debate around IT, right? I find it fascinating that IT talent is reversing. It used to be that utilities were poaching from the IBMs, Capgeminis of the world, and now it's the other way around. And we'll see it flip again, right? So the IT capability is quite critical. Market segmentation, which you talked about earlier. Getting from that 6 segments to 30 segments requires quite different thinking. Even the customer experience, customer relationships start changing because your call center calls turn out to be more coaching calls than actually service calls. I won't go into too much detail about EV and demand response. Clearly, new profit pools, new opportunities opening up there around data integration, software, et cetera. Energy efficiency and smart grid start merging. So and I'll show you an example in a minute, when you believe the smart home of the future, all the components, along with time of use pricing, works together, what does that do in concert to create demand destruction? It's quite dramatic, or could be quite dramatic. Monetizing the energy and non-energy data. So when you hear about Google Power Meter, Google getting into the space, the only way Google can make money, I don't buy the value proposition, because the only way Google can make money is by selling non-energy data to a third party. That's the only way that business model works. And we haven't seen that, but we have analogies. We have analogies in consumer packaged goods industries. If you look at what supermarketers did in supermarkets with the loyalty cards, there are analogies out there, and someone's going to figure it out. And when they do, monetizing that non-energy data coming from the home could be quite valuable. I talked a little bit regulatory. Completely different. When the utilities look at it, if demand destruction is going to happen, how are utilities prepared to meet that? What kind of loss of revenue recovery are they going to be prepared to do? And then finally, very interesting discussions with utilities recently about what is their role. Is this just going to happen and they're going to become an enabler for this? And therefore, they should just prepare to lose all the demand, make sure they're regulatorily protected, and have some sort of new customer strategy? Or should they fight back? Should they actually say, you know, all these values that Deepak was putting out, I'm going to stop all that. I'm going to make sure that net metering doesn't happen. The sellback is very difficult. There are utilities taking that posture, and they should, because regulatorily, they're not covered. So very interesting discussion happening there. Just two very quick examples. I know we want to move to Q&A. We've just recently completed quite a bit of work on smart home of the future in Europe. This is an Italian example. I'll just point to the right-hand side. If you look at consumption of an Italian household and you think of all the different things you could do to the building envelope, to the heating system, et cetera, you could see, and with some level of time of use pricing, which we were very conservative in our estimate there, which is B, you could see a 65% reduction in the need for energy in that home, right, across electricity and other sources. Some of these technologies are in the works, others are in development. And then just another example of, if you think that this is all very futuristic, in certain parts of the country, things are already starting to happen. So this is California. These are rate blocks for different customers. The rates are on the left-hand axis, vertical axis. What we've done is drawn lines of where the technology is actually break even. So rooftop solar, if you are a customer in this block and you are paying 36 cents a kilowatt hour, actually rooftop solar really makes sense for you. You're not going to buy from the utility. You're going to actually install your own system and, in fact, sell back. And we know sell back is happening. If you are anywhere in these blocks as a commercial customer, CHP makes a lot of sense. So this is evidence that demand destruction is going to start happening, obviously in certain jurisdictions, way earlier than others. But again, so in some ways, let me just kind of summarize, because I presented sort of a schizophrenic view, right? The first part was all these problems happening in smart grid, and then all these things, secondly, all these actually changes actually taking place. I think my view is that as we start resolving all the issues, so smart metering as that sort of piece of the business starts evolving, distribution automation, Voltvar, as we start getting regulatory models in, eventually we'll get these benefits. The big changes, and I agree with Deepak here, will really happen with things like storage, distributed gen on low voltage, and demand response, if we can understand how to get customers to do that. And when we have all of that, then you're going to see more of these kinds of things happening. So that's my view.
So great. Thank you so much for your presentations, and I imagine there are a few questions in the audience, and Marcia and I will pass the microphones around. I have one question, though, already from a web listener. Would you, and I'm paraphrasing this, would the panel speak to kind of the status of interoperability standards and what you kind of see happening in that domain?
Sure. The common information model efforts are a huge part of the interoperability wave in the industry. One more time, I'll lean back to some of the other IT industries that I came from. The state of interoperability in this industry, to put it mildly, has got a lot of upside. So as these standards mature, and I'm always a little nervous, no disrespect, when we expect Washington, D.C. to figure things out in terms of standards, and we sometimes lose speed. But if we as an industry can also get behind it, and GE is leading and driving that interoperability, we think that it'll enable many of these edge applications that we can't contemplate right now. This will open up the market for net new innovation where we feel very comfortable. So large organizations like GE are working hand in hand with the United States government and governments worldwide, frankly, to accelerate some of these standard conversations. We think roughly 30–40% of the standards that is required in the grid right now are being defined, endorsed, and being adopted by the industry. We think there is a lot more activity that is required in that space.
Hi. I really liked your idea of the parallel market for the renewable energy. I was wondering if you could expound a little bit on what those customers look like, and beyond just the benefit of using renewable energy, the societal benefit of it, what would be their benefit of participating in that market?
I think good question. We see that I think if you can create a class of flexible users, okay, then, and you can marry them with variable resources. I mean, our example of that is if you have a car, okay, it's driving 3 hours a day and you're stationary 21 hours a day. If you can find a charging point, if you have the infrastructure built around to be able to incentivize you to stay connected to the grid, then the 6 kilowatt hours of charge that you need can be delivered at any point in time that you're connected. And that creates the flexibility to be able to match you up with when the resource is available, when there is no congestion along the way, and it can be delivered to the point of use. So, you know, you should come out ahead for being able to play like that. So the whole idea would be that the cost would be lower as a result, but the cost on a holistic basis. So the way we've kind of looked at it is what comes out of your wallet as a user. You know, it is really the electricity bill you're paying as well as the gasoline bill and the cost of the car and the new cost of the battery and all of that. So all those costs are lumped together. And if that number is lower, then our feeling is that the user is going to be motivated to go in that direction.
Hello, I'm Ernie Johnston. I'm a startup out at 2. There are a lot of TLAs being thrown about. 3-letter acronyms. So I've got one for each of you. Jerry, you used AMI.
Automatic metering infrastructure.
All right, wonderful. Catch me up here. Deepak, you said AMR.
It's the same thing.
All right. And then Humayun, let's see, CHP.
That's combined heat and power.
All right, thank you.
Easy.
Hi, my name is Patty, and Hunyan, I'm not sure if I said that right. So I missed a part of your presentation when you talked about the fact that there's between a $1.1 and a $1.7 trillion investment needed, and that typically, historically, electric rates have gone up 2.2% per annum, but that $1 trillion investment is a 6% per annum increase. And then you said how you would pitch the smart grid you could pitch it to the regulator, but I didn't understand that.
Yep. Great clarification question. So when you look at generation, all the plants that we need to build for the next 10 years, transmission distribution infrastructure to get the spend back on so we don't have the 45-year-old average transformer situation, and then some investments in upgrading the customer information system. So some very basic estimates of compliance, et cetera. That's about the 1.1 to 1.5 trillion, depending on whose estimate you take. So that doesn't include any smart grid investment per se. Now, if you work that backwards, that is about a 6 to 7% per annum increase. Now, what the idea about smart grid is that when you're in a utility and you're trying to decide between allocating money towards a generation plant or complying with an RPS standard, or you're looking at discretionary spend on smart grid, And when you do the business cases, the smart grid essentially, what you would say is with all the benefits you get, it's an NPV positive investment, meaning over time, the benefits will outweigh, right? So what that means against that 1.1, 1.5 trillion is that it actually reduces the amount of generation you need to build. It reduces that overall spend that you need as a system. So instead of the 6% per annum increase, you'll need less because eventually you have lowered the amount of spend totally that you need as a system. And very simply, the way this would work is, to give you one example, if you had demand response, so customers actually behaved the way you wanted them to, you fed them pricing signals, they reduced their peak need and overall consumption, you basically shifted out the need for generation by 3 to 10 years, depending on jurisdiction. So that shift out basically shifts the amount of investment you need by 2020. Or the other example is if you control voltage levels, as Deepak was talking about, that could reduce consumption by 2 to 3%. That then postpones how much generation you need. So that lowers the overall need for the 1.1 to 1.5 trillion. So in other words, smart grid is the only NPV positive business case out there that a utility has, right? That's the other way to look at it. If you buy in all the benefits.
I'm glad to hear that.
Another question from the web. Would the panel please speak to current pilot projects underway and any kind of insight into what's going on, these pilot projects on a national basis?
I think, so you see a lot of variability in the pilot projects. I would just a couple of takeaways. Obviously, lots of them are happening particularly because of the stimulus funding. I would say the smart metering piece is pretty clear. That works. The communications work. There are hitches here and there, but that typically works. I don't pay too much attention to all these health issues that people are raising in California and Texas and all that. I think that's noise that'll go away. I think the challenge is on the home area network side. So all these benefits that have been promised with customers reducing demand, I don't think we've really seen the evidence for that yet. And I think on the grid side, which has sort of been the other component of the smart grid pilot, so getting automation going, getting volt bar, I think the early results are quite good on volt bar and automation. Automation is not really new technology per se. It's just a scale up of what's been done. So I would say, for the most part, pretty good results. Hard to really piece out what exactly is happening in the public information domain. But I think the most disappointing piece so far, in my view, has been the demand response component.
So if I may add, from a GE perspective, what we see in the industry, and this is a fair question to ask, is 2010, excuse me, was the year of the pilot. In essence, we saw the industry doing control sample investigation of technologies. We see that that some of the technology risk being retired. 2011 onwards, we should really see mainstream adoption. Some of the projects, excuse me again, like FP&L, like AEP, like Southern Company here, have certainly moved beyond the pilot to mainstream adoption from the AMI perspective, automatic metering infrastructure. We are also beginning to see electric vehicle pilots beginning to emerge in a big way. TVA is one of them. We're seeing Texas with EVgo beginning to happen. So my emphasis to the industry is to get a little bit more decisive and to share some best practices from utility to utility. And I know McKinsey can play a big role in that for us. What I want to ask for in terms of the going back to the fundamental need, which is undisputed, that we need, countries need to engineer and re-engineer their infrastructure here, is we need to stop this piecemeal death by pilot. We really need to start getting a little bit more decisive, getting a little bit more comfortable placing safe bets. Smart metering has an ROI business case if you play it out all the way to the consumer. The only point I'll push back slightly on my friend Humayun is I don't really believe that the net consumer demand is on a downward trajectory. The reality is we consume more power every year per capita. So the story I would tell the utility and the consumer at home is it is not that we are going to miraculously swap out my DLP, and I won't even tell you I have a DLP. You mentioned plasma. But LEDs are coming, but it requires a CapEx investment. The consumer's rate case for replacing of their existing entertainment infrastructure is also in question here. And we are not going to rip and replace what we have at home. The same thing applies to the utility on a macro perspective. So I will come back to continue the point of our consumption will increase, our consumption will continue to increase, but the rate of increase will go down.
I think the only other thing I wanted to add to that was, you mentioned distributed generation of mine, and we are involved with a number of distributed generation projects, and clearly lots of opportunities. If you kind of decouple it from rooftop solar, which you can regard as some form of distributed generation, but really look at distributed generation in a campus perspective, okay? We are involved in a lot of projects. We don't see a lot of scope from an ROI perspective just yet. I do see, overseas, a lot of very aggressive, large-scale demonstrations and pilots being put in place. And again, I'm very concerned that, if we lag behind, the lead's going to go somewhere else.
It's, again, a competitive advantage, having the most modern smart grid.
Yeah.
Regarding capital costs, all of you talked about, how expensive and how much upfront capital cost it is. Right now, a lot of the projects you talked about were funded through either stimulus funded or other government funding. And Dr. Devon talked about how the fact that government funding is probably going to go down in the upcoming years, if not this year. Where do you see the costs, the payment coming in for getting all these projects done? Because, other than government forcing people to pay more, because through the increased, bills for electricity, what other sources of funding are there out there, if any?
Got to be really, it's a great and tough question to answer. I think the answer also depends on the political fabric of each nation that is answering it. So I want to be really sensitive to that. There are certain countries that are leading with that as a public investment. And I'm not here judging one model versus the other. I can't speak to that. All I can say is here in America, our answer has been to depend upon the private industry to find a way to justify its business case to consumers. And we are having a little bit more challenge with that model. But in the end, consumers worldwide, no matter who pays for the initial CapEx, have to foot the bill.
I think I want to kind of address that slightly differently also. I think we agree that in the U.S., I don't think you're going to be able to ram something down people's throats that increases their cost significantly. And therein lies the challenge, and which is why kind of we've looked, over a longer time frame and tried to see, what makes sense. And I think exactly the kind of analysis that Mayan's done is really required. The challenge there is, I think, if you take a short-term perspective and say that electric cars should thrive on their own today, it's not going to happen because the cost is higher. Okay, so the bet that we have to place as a country is to say that, look, if you do the analysis over a certain amount of time, and this technology comes through, it's going to come, it's going to come about, and it's going to give us a significant improvement in cost and security. And you've got to make the bet at that point in time, and that's got to be done through incentives. It's got to be done through action, unfortunately, at the government level that plays these things out. Every long-term transformational technology, requires some kind of government action. Otherwise these technologies will never die because the people who are dominant, okay, in the industry sectors, they'll never allow those technologies to come through. So, you've got to have something that kind of allows that transformation to occur.
Yeah, and just to put your question in numbers, the trade-off is you're paying 10 cents, let's say, right now. Would you rather pay 10 cents now and 20 cents in 10 years, or 11 cents today and 18 cents in 20 years, right? By 2020? Because by investing in all these things, we lower, and then if you add all the things that Deepak talked about, then in fact that 18 could come down to 15 if you're selling back energy to the grid, et cetera.
Hi, Sam Collier. I'm actually very bullish on willingness to pay as the climate starts changing. But my question is, the scenario you mentioned about the utilities fighting this, the other scenario was Was that utilities actually trying to get that equipment put into the rate base and therefore have a return on investment on things on the consumer side of the meter?
Yeah, it is a situation where the utility has both the home area network equipment and the smart metering equipment, part of the rate base. It's approved. Their view is that, and I agree, I think overall demand is increasing, but when you actually, and certainly per capita consumption is increasing, but when you actually figure out, if you believe the things like on-site solar, and in this case, solar is in the money for residential customers, for commercial customers. If you think of a scenario where all these customers are going to go on site for their own generation, then there's a challenge that they're going to face. So the question they're asking is, yes, we get this rate based, but at the end of the day, that's great that we get this return, but if we have kWh loss, kilowatt hour losses, to a level where it offsets the gains we make on the asset base investment, that's the problem they're worried about.
If I may add just one other point, one of the incentive problems that I clearly see that the government policy needs to fix even here in the United States, and which is a big one, is I don't think the incentives are aligned such that the more efficient utility is rewarded for its efficiency. That's one of just the exact same example that applies in healthcare. The better doctor or the better hospital system or the better nurse doesn't have the patient come back in. How do they make their money? So the better utility that does a better job, how do they make their money? Unless those perverse incentives are clearly resolved, where the more efficient you are, the better your CapEx, the more you can make money, I think we have a little bit of a catch-22.
I think another important thing from a regulatory perspective is, we have absolute morass out here in terms of regulations. You have, every state has its own regulations, and if the electrons flow from one state into another, they're now subject to different rules. So it really can't work that way. So we really need to have some level of a unification of regulations across the country. And if you can do that, I suspect that the motive for investing is going to become a lot stronger.
Hello. I don't want to monopolize any more time. I do have separate questions for each of you, but I have one general question for the panel. Do either of you usually work with other industries that might directly be influenced by the smart grid or any other energy producing system? For instance, when we spoke earlier today, I mentioned athletics and the possibility of having a smart grid hybridize, with, let's say, LEEDs, the LEEDs paradigm for architecture, and how possibly more sports and athletic arenas could be built, and that could pave a way possibly for any smart grid innovations over the next several years. So that's just my general question as far as whether there are other organizations in athletics or agriculture or architecture that you work with on a regular basis.
Yeah, so if I may then, Snoddy, I think there's a couple of areas where I call these classic GE class problems, which are in a multi-dimensional, multi-industry. This fits very well into some of the way the company thinks, particularly at the corporate level. One example would be if you're building a next generation infrastructure for Rio 2014, can we create a best-in-class facility for the athletes worldwide? B, avoid the blackout that happened last year. That would be a bad idea when you're having the Olympics out there. How do you create core competencies which are common to these different industries that we go to separately as General Electric, the company, and pull that together in a common way so that the athletes have access to best-in-class healthcare equipment and care. At the same time, the stadium and the infrastructure for them, residential or competitive, have the best-in-class electrical infrastructure that scales for a hugely transient workforce that has just come in for 30 days or so. So that's a classic example of these big city initiatives, smart city initiatives, and how we are using cross-pollination of ideas. I don't know if that helps.
investments and the changes that need to be made. You mentioned incentives. I think everybody probably has the same concerns about more incentives, more stimuluses, and the reality of that. One of the slides we talked about silos, and we've always thought of energy in silos. It seems to me, now is the time, if we really want to move forward here, that we break down the silo where 98% of transportation has been dependent on oil. And we've seen the similar kind of shift occur in electricity generation since the oil embargo in the 70s. What will accelerate this change where we can redistribute our own wealth to us to stimulate these kind of changes in our society for our benefit?
I have some ideas, and I'm sure I probably get tomatoes thrown at me from everybody, but that's all right. I think part of it is that it's not just incentives that have to be provided. Maybe we don't provide incentives, but subsidies should not be provided that are adverse and really absurd. Why should gasoline be subsidized? Okay, why? I mean, so you're not measuring true cost of things, and yet the people who are kind of dominant in those spaces are managing to preserve the subsidies. And then you say, okay, now let's play on a level playing field, okay, kids? It's really not a level playing field. I mean, that's part of my problem, I think.
I think you said exactly what.
Okay.
There's a subsidy issue. You can have the tomatoes.
And I think the other part is we're not doing full cost accounting. Okay, in the past maybe it was okay. We didn't count water, we didn't count emissions, we didn't count all those things. It wasn't possible to do it, or we didn't think the impact was going to be high. Today we count micro pennies as they flow back and forth. Don't tell me we can't count these things. Okay, so I think unless you can count it in a verifiable way, you can't allocate the costs, and nobody's going to be willing to pay it. So I think these are the structural issues I think that need to be fixed, and if you can fix them, everything else will fall into place. I'm a firm believer in the market. It's just a question of, when advantages are going one way, then you can't expect it all to balance out.
I think I've remembered what I was going to say. Shale gas, right? So you look at the whole development of shale in the last 3 years, and you look at cost effectiveness of shale. You look at the fact that shale is now delinked from petroleum. It's now coal-based floor. Different views about how long that's going to last. Is it 3 years? Then it's going to link back to petroleum. But I think there's a very fascinating thing happening with shale that is shifting the power curve. If you believe in more distributed generation penetration, the combination of shale and generation on low voltage could completely change how we think about petroleum-based pricing. But fundamentally, I agree that without the subsidies being lifted, I think we're in this shadow cost economy that is not really reflecting the true price that it should.
My name is Joe Lindsay, and first I'd like to say that every question I had, you answered before I got a chance. So a specific question that I'd like to ask on the first presentation, it was noted that large power users are willing to generate their own power on site. I can think of paper products industry for one. But the last clause in that statement said, and they're willing to pay a premium for power. I wasn't sure whether you were referring to their own generation as costing a premium or peaking generation to supplement that. Could you explain that?
Sure, and I think that's a very fair question. So when you decide to build your own backup power plants, you're fundamentally recognizing that your business assurance is more important than the cost of power per kilowatt hour. So you're already paying a premium for that, and you're acting with your checkbook. You're voting with your checkbook. Because for us to say that industrial organizations, pick on a couple, Dow, I mean, when they do it at the scale that a Dow does, one hopes that they are reaching or threatening to reach the economies of scale that a large-scale utility does. But that would be a big accomplishment for them. So they're already paying a premium for it, for that business assurance that they want, number one. Number two, if despite that business assurance of power being available when they want it on demand, 7 by 24 by 365, if they're looking for a second set of reassurance, let's call it a service level assurance term, and they say, but despite my best planning, if I need power, and my steel plant is still rolling between on a July afternoon, they will pay for the peaker plant, because then they have done the economics to basically say, my production and the money I make from the production is more valuable than shutting it down because power is too expensive. And for me, the litmus test simply is they are in business and they don't shut down production during those really expensive hours. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Would it be possible to combine other motivated users into groups that would have the exact same incentive?
Well, that was the aggregated rooftop question. So for example, we listened to a wonderful presentation from Walmart. Talking about rooftops, that's a lot of rooftops worldwide. So if they are going to massively go deploy solar, like I heard in the presentation, will they now become, in addition to everything else they are good at, one of the world's biggest utilities? But you know where I'm going.
So John, you get to close it out with a question.
This is a lot of pressure. Good. Well, taking your example, I think that the next stage is that, let's say I'm DuPont, and I really don't want to put all my money into that alternative generator. And I would like, there are, some would say, some fools, friends or family, walking around who will actually invest the money in that so that they get a return under current incentives, albeit transient right now. But there's a regulatory prohibition that says, oh no, you can't possibly get third-party financing. In other words, you cannot let that developer walk in there, build that solar PV farm, and sell it to DuPont. That's not allowed legally. So how do you react to that?
I don't know. Humayun, you want to take this one, but I'll tell you my 2 cents. I'm not a political creature. I like regulation when it accelerates competition, doesn't decelerate. I think that's what the government of the United States wants to do. So if regulation is prohibiting competition, it's a bad idea.
Yeah, I think it's a murky world of whether you can have a third-party intermediary between the utility and the customer. That's where you need very good lawyers, right, who can argue your case to say, well, even under very regulated jurisdictions, you can actually have a third-party intermediary under certain conditions. So if you have a separate contract and that intermediary on an informal basis takes over your bill payments, et cetera, that is definitely doable. We've seen things like that happen in New York State, in Arizona, where we've seen industrial commercial customers actually have third parties come in and manage all of that without any regulations changing.
2 items. First, let us thank our speakers. Wasn't this a fantastic? Thank you very much. And thank you all for being here as well. The second item is circle March 30th, Wednesday, March the 30th, for the next program on energy management and data. So thanks very much for being here.